In order to do something about what one has in life, it is necessary to organize processes of governance towards various events. And in order to organize the processes of governance towards various events, one must be governarially literate. But here there may be objections that now not only economists are learning management, but everyone is learning management. Those of technical education are told something about the theory of automatic control and about the governance towards specialized objects on the basis of how the tradition of solving tasks of governance has taken shape. Meanwhile, the passport of the specialty of the Higher Attestation Committee in Social Philosophy has one of the points of relevance for research where such a thing is recognized as the crisis of fragmentation, the crisis of social studies and ways of overcoming it. That is, it came to the point that social philosophers were the first to understand that science, as a whole, had ceased to exist and is fragmented into a whole slew of mutually isolated fields, and some kind of nonsense regularly emerges from the interdisciplinary chasms. What to do about it? This concerns not only social studies, this concerns all, the humanitarian sciences, natural and applied disciplines. If one looks at what every specialist does, then one can see that every specialist somehow governs something. Even if he does not use the term governance, nevertheless, the beginning of the process and the bringing of it to the final result is always a process of governance. In the previous lecture, I showed you the groups of objective laws, and one of the groups is specifically governarial laws, on the basis of which all processes of governance in general are built, starting with a child riding a tricycle, and he has a task: go in the puddle, do not go around it, and ending with the engagement of several states in a complex project, like the International Space Station. These are all tasks of governance. In the practice of life, governors are divided into two categories. There is a small in number group of governors who can be called governors psychologists. They may not know in principle anything about theory of governance or about the subject domain in which they are going to govern something. They are given one quality. They are able to choose from the whole plurality of people who face them, professionals who can be entrusted with the endeavor, and moreover, who will not lie. That is, professionals who can be relied upon. Such a governor psychologist is able to assemble a team of professionals who will carefully govern anything. If a hospital is entrusted to him, then after some time, this will be the best hospital of a certain field. And if he is entrusted with a technical project, then this project will be successfully completed. But such governance professionals can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The majority of those who claim to be governance professionals consider themselves entitled not to know their subject domains, theories, or practices of governance, and to become bureaucrats. The bureaucratic style of governance is a disaster for any society, including modern Russian society. Therefore, in order for specialists from different fields to be able to participate in complex projects and bring these complex projects to a good result, everyone must be competent and governarially literate. The country that is the first to provide governarial literacy for everyone, this country is simply destined to become the leader of civilizational development. There is no other way. We live in a time when there are many theories of governance. In addition to theories of governance, many fields of management have emerged. And it seems one should only study and everything will be fine. But if we pose the task of governarial literacy for everyone, then the first question is, what quality, among all the pluralities of qualities, should the best theory of governance have? In your opinion, what is the main requirement?
Ну, может быть, чтобы ее можно было легко применить именно на практике, чтобы она не была сильно оторвана от реальной жизни. То, что любой мог бы ей воспользоваться и понять, как бы, чтобы не было...
Это только одна сторона вопроса.
This is only one side of the question. And the second side of the question is concluded in the following. With all that Angelina said, the theory of governance should be able to describe any process in nature, in technology, in society, in the psyche of an individual, and in the psyche of collectives, as a process of governance or self-governance. If this quality is ensured, then one can say that this is a general theory of governance, which on the one hand can be mastered by everyone, and on the other hand, it is applicable in any field of activity, and on its basis, as the language of interdisciplinary communication, specialists of different fields can interact with each other in complex projects. If this is not the case, then we either have some kind of narrowly specialized theory that outside the area in which it is applied cannot solve tasks, or we have, in the extreme case, demagogy or peri-governorial themes. Unfortunately, management, the theory of governance towards the quality of production, is largely demagogy on peri-governorial themes, because there is no conceptual determinedness. And what is behind those words? Every person has to think for himself. If he succeeds in thinking, then he can become a great guru of management and governance towards quality. If he fails, then he becomes a hostage. But anyway, the conceptual apparatus of the corresponding field is slang that allows a professional corporation to distinguish its own from others. But this conceptual apparatus is not intended to solve real tasks in life. Therefore, all theories of governance form the structure for the setting and the solution of tasks of governance. These are their common qualities, and they differ from each other by what architecture of structures for setting and solving tasks of governance each of them offers. What does this mean in practical life? If you use a certain primitive theory of governance, its structures allow you to solve a certain class of tasks of governance. But if your competitors, opponents, enemies use a more advanced theory of governance, then a predetermination arises that a task of governance will arise, which they will guaranteedly solve on the basis of their theory, while you can solve that task only miraculously. This means you don't know how, but you will solve it, or you cannot solve it at all. And then if you cannot solve the task of governance in a competitive environment, you suffer damage up to the point that states cease to exist. If states cease to exist, then it will be no laughing matter. This is why the question on a theory of governance, and the best among the whole plurality of theories of governance, is indeed one of the most life-important questions. Now let's move on to the theory of governance. In 1991, the Institute of the USA and Canada commissioned the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Management Processes for a research project on predicting the scenario in the behavior of great superpowers until 2005. Such conflict situations are usually modeled on the basis of the apparatus of game theory. But the apparatus of game theory is one of the directions of probability theory, and actually, it presupposes the random nature of the realization of these or those scenarios. Random in the sense that it is unmotivated. And how about politics? Yes, there is a stream of randomnesses, accidents, but there is a certain motivation that stands above this stream of accidents. This motivation realizes itself, in some way, through a stream of random events. Since this was understandable, another apparatus was required that could describe and simulate those processes that the apparatus of game theory simply cannot adequately reflect. As a result, the sufficiently general theory of governance appeared. From 1997 to 2000, a course on the sufficiently general theory of governance was taught at the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Processes of Governance at Leningrad State University. After the death of Vladimir Ivanovich Zubov, the course there was stopped. But nonetheless, this course exists, the course materials can be downloaded from the internet, and you can familiarize yourself with them. In a brief summary, the sufficiently general theory of governance is 110 pages of book text, enough to read through in 2 to 3 days, and then think over the course of at least 6 months and more. Therefore, at the lecture, I can only tell you about principally significant things that distinguish the sufficiently general theory of governance from everything else. In your opinion, what does the process of governance begin with? Almost good, because you started with a need. Usually, they start with something else. Managers usually start with the organization of the structure they will govern.
Изначально цель должна быть, чего нужно достигнуть, а потом нужно определиться со структурой.
Тоже почти хорошо.
Also almost good. The process of governance begins with the discernment of factors of the environment that put pressure on the psyche, cause discomfort, and, as a reaction to this discomfort, the process of governance arises. That is, when objectives appear, this is not the beginning of the process of governance. This is a little later. When needs arise, needs include objectives, but this is also a little later. And it all begins with the fact that you identify the factors of the environment that generate the discomfort that you are experiencing. Then the question arises before you: what to do with this discomfort? Then comes the step of setting of objectives. You determine the objectives. The next step is how to achieve these objectives. The question suggests an answer that results in the appearance of a conception of governance. After you have formed a conception of governance, begins that with which managers usually begin. This is the organization of a structure that will carry this conception of governance, its algorithmics, and will realize it. Moreover, there is one more subtlety. It is usually believed that when governance is organized, it is always a structure. In the structure, duties, responsibilities are neatly distributed, who does what, and so on and so forth. And what if you throw gossip, a rumor, into society? Do you create a structure or not? No. But if the gossip spreads and the reaction to it is predictable for you, that is, the gossip was made for this reaction, then society reacts to this gossip in a way that is desirable for you, and you get a result. And this result is also the result of the carrying out of the process of governance. Further, you have organized the process of governance, it flows by itself or under your guidance, and then some errors in the conception are revealed. The conception needs to be corrected. The process of governance also needs to be corrected, because the circumstances of the carrying out of the conception may differ from what you expected, and you need to react to them. And the process comes to the fact that the objectives are achieved or not achieved. If the objectives are achieved, then they are no longer relevant. Then you free the resources that were used in this process of governance. If the objectives are not achieved, then you return to the first point. That is, you scratch the back of your head, look at the discomfort, engage yourself in the setting of objectives again, and so on. All this, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, is called the entire function of governance. The entire function of governance describes the circulation of information in the process of governance, beginning from the moment when a subject determines a vector of objectives, up until the completion of the process of governance. The sequence of multi-qualitative actions. 1. Discerning a factor of the environment with which an intellect collides from among a huge diversity of processes in creation. Forming a stereotype, skill, in order to discern that factor in the future. Forming a vector of objectives of governance concerning this factor, and integrating this vector into the general vector of one's own objectives. Forming an objective-oriented function, conception, of governance. Organizing and reorganizing structures of governance, controlling, monitoring the activity carried out by the structures in the process of governance, and coordinating their interactions. Liquidating these structures if they are not needed, or supporting their functioning until the next usage. Stages 1 to 7 always exist. There can exist interim stages that one can join or split into more detailed stages. The entire function of governance begins with the discernment of factors of the environment that cause discomfort, and it ends with either the achievement of the objectives or a revision of the conception of governance, if there is someone to revise it, because if governance fails, then it may turn out that there will not be anyone to revise the conception of governance. Everything I have told you is kind of banal, right? Well, there is a factor that puts pressure on the psyche, discomfort arises, for example, the window is open, the wind is blowing through it. This is a factor of the environment that creates discomfort. And practice shows that banal things are most difficult to reach a person's consciousness. Because if you look at any textbook or manual, you will find that the description of processes of governance begins not from the first stage of the entire function, but somewhere from the middle. So you are offered a certain model for solving a certain task. You take this model, start acting, and you get two variants. If the circumstances in which you use this model correspond to the conditions of the modeler, then you will get the result that was promised. And if the circumstances do not correspond to the plurality of the admissible that was laid by the modeler in the basis of this model, then you will get some negative result, and you will sit and scratch the back of your head. Why is this result negative? A positive solution was promised in the manual, and the result is negative because in courses there is no concept of the entire function of governance, and everything that is at the first stages of the entire function of governance is considered in some way already solved, and solved alternatively. Thus, it turns out that the one who controls the first stages of the entire function of governance is the one who controls all the subsequent stages. Do you remember such a tale? Tops and Roots. A bear and a man organize a joint agricultural enterprise. They assign responsibilities. The bear plows, the man controls. The first year, the man asks the bear, "Do you want tops or roots?" "Tops," the bear answers. "All right, we sow turnips." The second year, the man asks the bear, "Do you want tops or roots?" The bear is already wise, so he says, "I want roots." "All right, we sow wheat," the man says. This tale brings us to another theme. It is the question on how stability and balance are understood. I will draw an axis of time. Here is a process. Here is moment T1. At moment T1, a certain disturbing impact is exerted on the process. What then? And then there are variants. It goes into infinity, like so. It wavers and also goes into infinity. This is traditionally understood as instability. But if after that, everything returns to its previous state, like this or like that, then these are already different types of stability, with different caveats.
Это уже разные виды устойчивости с разными оговорками. Понятно?
Clear? Any objections? The tale about the tops and the roots is actually a prompt.
Значит, теперь вот смотрите.
Let us look at an example of a single-rotor helicopter. If one draws it like in a cartoon, then it is like this.
Ну, если рисовать как в мультфильме, то это вот так. А дальше начинаются...
And then the subtleties of aerodynamics begin. The lift force is created by the main rotor. Suppose we made the main rotor and rigidly fixed the rotor blades in the hub. The rotor rotates, lift force arises, and the helicopter takes off. What will come next?
Сила, вертолет взмыл в воздух, что дальше?
It will roll on its side and fall. Why? Because the lift force is proportional to the square of the speed. And if there is a breeze, then one blade moves towards the oncoming airflow, the other blade moves in the direction of the oncoming airflow, aerodynamic forces of different magnitude affect them, a healing moment occurs, the helicopter falls on its side, and we pick up the debris. Do helicopters fly? Why?
Благодаря хвосту.
Не благодаря хвосту.
No, not thanks to the tail. The tail rotor solves another task. It compensates for the torque. The thing is, that the blades are not rigidly fixed. Boris Nikolaevich Yuriev, in 1915, invented a device called swashplate, which controls the angle of attack of the blades. Thanks to this, the healing moment, which arises from the inequality of aerodynamic forces, is also compensated, and the helicopter can fly tail forward, sideways, and so on, depending on how you install the swashplate, in what position. What Yuriev did is a particular case that demonstrates this here.
Это не самое полное определение устойчивости.
This is not the most complete definition of stability, since this is a particular case of what can be called the stability of an object in terms of predictability of the behavior of the object. That is, if your object is obviously unstable in the classical sense, but you somehow manage to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of the object, then you can enter it into a mode of governance that will be quite stable. And this single-rotor helicopter with a swashplate is one of the variants in which the task of stability of the object in terms of predictability of behavior was solved in some way. Another example, have you seen a hydrofoil? These are boats with wings. The wing scheme is organized in such a way that if the wing comes to the surface, then the lift force on it falls and sinks. If the wing sinks, the lift force increases and the wing comes to the surface. Thanks to such hydrodynamics, the boat moves stably in the wing mode as long as the water is smooth, there is no wind, there are no waves. And if there are some waves, then the waves begin to strike the bottom at a speed of 50 kilometers, and the strikes can give you a hard time on the boat. But we want to float above the water surface, right? Then someone clever says, let's make the wings deep placed. The hull of the boat will go over the crests of the waves, and everything will be fine. But it turns out that as soon as you apply these deep placed wings, this stabilization effect appears. What to do? On the wings, one needs to make a whole bunch of flaps and connect them to the control elements. Stick everything with a whole lot of sensors that determine the position of the hull with respect to disturbing impacts, everything else, and move the flaps during the journey. Yes, you can do it like that. In Soviet times, the hydrofoil Typhoon was made this way. It was supposed to go along the Leningrad-Tallinn route, but the Americans, the Boeing company, created hydrofoils. They also successfully exploited them, and there were also several other projects. In other words, without even having a concept of the existence of such a phenomenon as the stability of an object in terms of predictability of behavior, the people solved these tasks and achieved a result that was impossible from the point of view of others. Well, if you understand that stability of an object in terms of predictability of behavior is a broader concept of stability than what is offered to you by physics and technology, then, seeing an unstable process or a process that, due to instability and unpredictability, does not lend itself to governance, you can set yourself the task of how to predict its behavior under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance as such. If you are able to solve this task, then in principle, you can take the object under governance. Another thing is what resources you need and how to organize these resources. And if you cannot solve the task of the stability of an object of governance in terms of predictability of its behavior, then you will never be able to govern it. From this correlation stem such aphorisms as to govern is to foresee. This applies to everything: technology, societies of global civilization, some small particular processes of governance. If you can foresee, then in principle, possibilities for governance open up before you. If you cannot foresee, then you will never govern it. Well, then the question arises: how to foresee? In general, there are two variants, and they are connected. The first variant, scientific knowledge, allows you to build a model of a process or an object. By working with the model at a pace ahead of the factual course of events, you can foresee its behavior. By modifying an object, you can achieve performance characteristics acceptable to you. Next, the question arises: where do theories come from? Something comes from experiments, but something comes not from experiments, because all scientific theories are, roughly speaking, an integral. This is comprehended intuitions throughout the time of the entire history of humanity. Because in order for a new theory to appear, to begin with, you need an intuitive insight. When it appears, then it can be comprehended and expressed in words, symbols of mathematics, some other symbols, and a theory appears. And all theories must provide a solution to the task of predictability of behavior. Therefore, the principle of scientific consistency of theories is one. Practice is the criterion of truth. That is, if you open up a cookbook and take a pickle recipe, you should get pickles. If you get something else, then there is something wrong. This is also the case with theories and their applicability in life. And here, if you pay close attention and turn to the history of science, then we will find that since the time when positivism appeared, in fact even a little earlier because positivism appeared as a consequence of this, the principle of practice is the criterion of truth has been forced out of science by another principle, the requirement of repeatability of the result of the experiment. Where is the trap? There are many traps, because not all experiments are reproducible. In addition, there may be unique phenomena that are difficult to reproduce experimentally, but nonetheless, they exist in nature. For a long time, the French Academy of Sciences considered all the evidence of meteorites falling as a fiction, and when a meteor shower fell on one of the French towns, and there was nowhere to go from these stones, the Academy of Sciences had to admit, yes, this happens, stones fall from the sky. Another point. Remember all sorts of tricky math tasks where you simplify parentheses and as a result lose the solution. After all, in principle, this is an error, and this error is guaranteedly reproduced, and it is not perceived as an error by those who make it. In order not to digress, surf the internet. There are videos on the theme that twice 2 equals 5. It all starts with the fact that A equals to A multiplied by B. Then both sides of the equation are multiplied by A. Then some more manipulations are done. Then parentheses appear. The parentheses are simplified. And in the end, 2 equals 5. And no one notices that in the parentheses, there is A to the power of minus AB. But according to the first line, this is 0. That is, the requirement of repeatability of the result does not guaranteedly prevent an error. As for the question of how intuition works, this is already a question that goes beyond the framework of theory of governance, because intuition is one of the features of man's psyche. Some firmly adhere to the fact that this does not exist and cannot exist, while others use the fact that intuition exists and it is necessary to develop skills for using it. But this is a different theme. So it turns out that the question on stability in terms of predictability refers to the first stages of the entire function of governance. Because if you have discerned a factor of the environment and determined what you want, then you have to form a conception of governance. If you cannot form a conception of governance, you cannot govern. And in order to form a conception of governance, you have to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of the object under the impact of the external environment, internal changes in the object, and governance as such. As a result of this, a model arises. And on the basis of this model, you somehow organize something. These are the key stages of the organization of processes of governance, entrance into them, for the analysis of already existing processes of governance, in order to discern errors in them. And, if textbooks on management say nothing about it, if the automatic control theory course does not say anything about it, then you are hostages of those models which are offered to you. And the models you generate, if you build models from scratch, actually they will not always be correct in relation to the tasks that you are going to solve. Here I've drawn something. First, I want. Second, I want. Third, I want. And so on until the nth. What is this? This is your reaction to the discerned factor that puts pressure on your psyche. This is the vector of the objectives of governance, because these are objectives of governance. So, these are your wants, and this is reality. That is, the situation as such. The vector of the current state. If you subtract the first from the second, you get the vector of error. Well, further, there are two variants. Here is the situation as such. So you strain your willpower, and then you get what you want. There are few such variants, because in the overwhelming majority of cases, you cannot directly impact the result you want to get. That is, in most cases, you cannot impact this parameter, the situation as such. And then you look at what else the situation is described with. And your vector of the current state acquires dimensionality. And this dimensionality becomes larger than the dimensionality of the vector of the objectives of governance. But on account of the additional parameters, you can choose from a plurality of them some parameters that you can directly impact. When they begin to change, as a result of the fact that you impact them directly through the objective laws of being, they will entail a change in that which you cannot directly impact, but want to come to a determined form. This is the equation of state of ideal gas by Mendeleev-Clapeyron. Suppose you have a hermetic vessel, and you want something from the gas in this vessel. For example, you want to increase pressure. Can you increase the pressure in a hermetic vessel just like that? If you turn to the formula, then you can heat the vessel and the pressure will rise. But in addition to everything else, the equation allows you to calculate how much you need to heat in order to get the pressure you want. Are you interested in the volume of the vessel in this case? No. So if you correlate to this, then the pressure here, you cannot impact it. The temperature is here, you can impact it. And the volume is free parameters, which in the process of governance can take any values. Any values are considered admissible. And further it turns out like this. If you set a task of governance, then this you must fill in. If you are not able to fill this in, then you will not be able to govern, because all this has to be present. But this is absent, so this is either parameters that you cannot control, yes, they can be free parameters, or this is parameters controlled by someone else, and a conflict of governance may arise. Among other things, everything here has to be metrologically consistent. Metrologically consistent. This means that an outside observer, equipped with certain measuring instruments or his own sensors, has to distinguish the green from the red. If the possibility of this distinguishing is required for governance, but this is absent, then governance is impossible. Therefore, everywhere, except for the humanitarian sciences, unfortunately, the questions of metrology are, if not in the first place, then in the second. Because if you want to get something, you have to describe it metrologically consistently. If you do not describe this metrologically consistently, then all sorts of troubles may arise. Because these parameters will not be controlled by you or anyone else, or they will be controlled by someone in such a way that you will not like how they are controlled. Therefore, if you find yourself solving a task of governance, there is a vector of objectives, there is a vector of the current state, and you are not able to fill in this table, then in the process of governance, troubles await you. The second point, you know that in equations you can move different parts in different directions. It turns out that in principle, what is a vector of objectives for you, for someone else, it may be a vector of error of governance. And if you achieve your objective, then that someone else's error grows. And accordingly, if his error of governance grows, then he gets nervous, takes some actions, and a conflict of governance begins. In other words, the question on the subjects that stand behind the processes of governance and the turning of the vector of objectives of governance into the vector of error in transition from one to another subject is also a very relevant question, at the least in the practice of social governance. In technical tasks, one can come across such things, but much more seldomly. All conversations on the theme of governance are conversations about what is happening in this system here. Here you see a system of governance, an object of governance, and an environment with which the objects interact. This here is usually called an enclosed system. Enclosure is understood not in the sense that it is isolated from the outside world. It interacts with the outside world. Enclosure is understood in the sense that the system of governance and the object are enclosed on each other. But this is a classic. The classic implies that feed-forward lines go from the system of governance into the object of governance, and through them, a governing impact or a governing signal is transmitted. And through the feedback lines, information about the state of the object is sent to the system of governance. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, feed-forward lines go not only into the object, but also go into the environment. These are also feed-forward lines. And feedback lines come not only from the object, but also from the environment. Here is an example that such an approach is justified. You are driving. You are about to change lanes. You press the turn signal. This is an act of governance. This is an act of governance in relation to the road situation. That is, this approach is appropriate. Now, when you start to rotate the steering wheel, then you are already governing your car. The same with feedback lines. If you are going to change lanes, and you see ahead or behind you, there is someone doing something, you will take into account the fact of this. To say it differently, this approach is quite appropriate for those situations where there are other subjects in the environment who govern their objects, and you have to take into account the character of their governance when working out your own. And here is the second variant. When there is a second system of governance in the environment that claims to govern the same object, if second systems of governance appear, then it turns out that what is for you feedback lines is for the second system feed-forward lines, and what is feed-forward lines for you is feedback lines for the second system. This is significant for a situation when you are dealing with a hierarchy of governance. If this subject is hierarchically higher than this one, then this one here is a self-governed system that is under hierarchically higher governance. If it is self-governed, then the hierarchically higher governance does not govern it all the time. Here the question arises, when does the hierarchically higher governance show its hand in the course of the process of governance? When this process of self-governance does not quite correspond to the vector of objectives of the hierarchically higher governance. Moreover, the reaction of the hierarchically higher governance may be different. The mildest form is a notification that one steers in the wrong way. The most severe form is removal from governance and the taking over of this governance. What does this have to do with life? Pay attention to the fact that history does not remember almost a single positive prophecy about the future. History only remembers negative prognoses that came true. Let us turn to the Greek epic. The Trojan War. How did it all start? The daughter of Priam, king of Troy, Cassandra, comes to her father and explains to him that Paris is going to Greece. In Greece he will steal Helen away. The Greeks will have to pay a return visit. There will be a war. In the course of this war, these and those will perish. Troy will be destroyed. Those who will survive will fall into slavery. What should be the normal reaction of the king? The normal reaction of the king should be as follows. Call Paris, call Euclid or someone else, put Paris at a desk to study geometry, and until he passes a test, no trips to Greece. If the scenario is carried out in this way, then the situation is discharged. Paris arrives in Greece after some time. The hormones in him and Helen are already in other phases. They meet, greet one another, smile and say goodbye. There is no Trojan War. Troy could still have stood today, but then we would not know any of the heroes from the Trojan War. They would have lived some other lives. Maybe some would have stood out in different spheres, but all that we know would not have happened. If one looks at history, there are very few cases when someone reacted to negative prophecies in such a way that the prophecies could not be realized. Indeed, there are very few such cases. Well, here the question arises. Where did prophecies come from? Unfortunately, this thematics is not included in educational standards. But Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, putting forward the concept of the noosphere, they were not delusional. They pointed to certain aspects of reality. Vernadsky, in his works, characterizes the noosphere as a regulator. That is, as a system of governance of a higher level than any individual and any person. Accordingly, if the planet as a whole has reason, and the Noosphere exists and is not an invention of Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, then if something moves in the wrong direction, information about the consequences of a particular course of events can come from the level of the Noosphere, and it is necessary to respond to it by changing something in the psychodynamics of society so that this negativity will not come to be. Moreover, what I have just said about the need to react is not some epochal scientific discovery, thinking people have always known about this. If you look at what the holy ascetics of all confessions taught, then in general, their approach is also such that if something negative appears, then you have to repent. Why? Because the process of repentance is the identification of errors in the algorithmics of one's own psyche. If you discern errors, then the erroneous algorithms are not implemented. When you have time, go to the opera house. Watch the opera, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitej. Good music, a profound philosophical plot. In this opera, there is the same thing. A reaction to a negative prognosis is repentance, that is, changing one's own views on the line of behavior and intention for the future changes the future, which seems to be inevitable. So this here is very life-relevant and justified. Further on, a question on schemes of governance arises. If we completely erase these feedback lines, what will be? There will be what is called a program scheme of governance. In the program scheme of governance, there is a certain timer. For instance, I give a countdown. Start. The 3rd second, execute command number 1. Completed. The 10th second, execute command number 2. Completed. Will the result be achieved? It will be achieved, but with a caveat. If the conditions of the work of the program correspond to those for which the program was written. For example, regional ship modeling competitions take place. At a distance, there is a missile boat with 4 programmed missiles. The task is to pass a distance, and at a distance release missiles, and then go through the gate. The boat must reach the competitors without going anywhere else. But something happens. The boat stops at a distance. The wind makes it move around. But the program is working. And now the moment comes when the first missile is released. And it flies well in the direction of the table at which the competition judges are sitting. When the second missile is released, all the judges hide under the table. This is an example of the fact that the program scheme of governance is functionally operable, and it provides an acceptable quality of governance in those cases when the conditions in which the program is realized correspond to those that were installed in the program. But if the conditions do not correspond, then what? Then what is called a program adaptive scheme of governance is needed. The most widespread is the law of governance. It includes parameters of the environment. And depending on what the parameters of the environment are, this or that governance is worked out, although the algorithmics of governance actually does not change. The next question is related to whether you are familiar with such a concept as evaluation. How is an evaluation understood in mathematics? What is the essence? There is a certain object that is characterized by a large number of parameters. A person's ability to perceive parameters at the rate of real time is limited. 7 to 9 objects simultaneously, 15 bits per second, no more. And if there are many parameters, and the operator must somehow react to them, then everything should be reduced to something smaller, and the concept of evaluation appears. That is, there is a certain algorithm that converts this plurality of initial parameters that characterize the object into one thing, into one parameter. And this parameter is called evaluation. Evaluations can be consistent or inconsistent. In order for an evaluation to be consistent, it is required that all the parameters on the basis of which it is built should be metrologically consistent. An algorithm that converts a plurality of parameters into an evaluation has to be correct. In most cases, it has to be unambiguous over the entire plurality on which the arguments included in it are determined. That is, the parameters of the object. In the theory of governance, the dimensionality of the vector of error of governance can be very large. Several tens, hundreds, thousands of parameters can be included in the characteristics of the systems. What to do with them? This leads to the fact that an evaluation of the vector of error of governance appears. The evaluation of the vector of error of governance is called quality of governance. It's simple. We use the term quality of governance often without comprehending what is behind it. This is what is behind it. Everything that is included here has to be metrologically consistent, and the algorithm has to be correct. Suppose that the program adaptive scheme operates. The parameters of the environment are such that the evaluation of the quality of governance turns out to be extremely low. Besides, the parameters of the environment become so bad that the quality of governance becomes unacceptable. What to do? Then physics begins. If we analyze the operation of the program adaptive scheme of governance, then we get the following. You have some sensors that take parameters from objects. What is the sensitivity of the sensors? There is a certain threshold of perception. Everything that is below the threshold of perception is perceived by the sensors as zero. And what is below the threshold of perception, does this impact the object? It does. Next, something above the threshold of perception impacts the object. The object, under the impact of this, leaves the ideal mode of functioning. The sensors react. They need some time. The system of information processing needs some time. The system of transmission of governing impact needs some time. The executive bodies need some time. Under their impact, the object of governance begins to respond to this governance. It also needs some time to react. This shows that even if you work out an ideal governorial decision, it will still always be lagging behind in relation to the disturbing impact for which you need to compensate. That is, you are always late. There are many reasons, but you are always late. And it turns out that this delay can be critical in relation to the quality of governance in the program adaptive scheme, or it can be admissible. And if it is critical, then there arises the wish to introduce prognostics into the process of working out of governorial decisions. If you, at the pace of development of the situation, can prognose its development, then you can build governance proactively in relation to the disturbing impact. Then what you get is called a predictor-corrector scheme of governance. The name comes from the method of computational mathematics, in which the solution is found by the method of successive approximations according to the scheme: prognosis of solution, verification of solution, correction of prognosis. Such is the cycle. The predictor-corrector scheme is characterized by the fact that if in the program adaptive scheme, here, all the feedback lines are enclosed through the past, then in the predictor-corrector scheme, a number of feedback lines are enclosed through the prognosable future. Therefore, you can reduce the system response delays to zero, even to negative values. That is, you will have proactive governance. For example, if an adversary is preparing to attack you, you know this. You have deployed troops where necessary. The adversary immediately has no desire to attack. This is also used in technology. However, the highest quality of governance, all other things being equal, but provided that all three schemes are functionally operable, is achieved only in the predictor-corrector scheme. It is beyond competition in comparison with the others, although it is more complex, since it requires the organization of prognostics at the pace of working out of a governorial decision. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, the concept of three methods of governance is given. The first method is structural. The name comes from the fact that the quality of governance is conditioned by the architecture of the structure which carries the algorithmics of governance. The algorithmics of governance, to a certain extent, is imprinted in the structure. The structure is a certain collection of elements, every one of which is specialized according to function. They are all interconnected, and they all interact with each other and the environment. They carry the algorithmics of governance. Speaking of the quality of governance, you can build a structure from elements that possess extremely low functionality. That is, the elements are on the verge of unsuitability for usage. But if you are not mistaken in building the architecture of the structure, then you will achieve the objective of governance with an acceptable for you quality. That is why this method of governance is called structural. And if you have extremely high functional elements, but you have mixed something up in the organization of the structure, then the quality of governance will be unacceptably low, and you will not be able to achieve the objectives that you intend to achieve. The next question is about the analysis of structures. There is the apparatus of network planning that is used to govern projects. The second task, for which the apparatus of network planning can be used, is for the analysis of the structures of organization staffing tables in terms of their governorial consistency. Because if we talk about governance in society, then governance in society is an art that involves fragmentation of the project into more or less independent modules, distribution of personal responsibilities for each of the modules, distribution of powers that allow the person in charge to perform the work related to the module, distribution of resources that are necessary for each module to be carried out. If all this is ensured, then the governance is realized, the tasks are solved. And whatever one says, the reason for the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 is concluded in the fact that these 4 tasks were not effectively solved. And the fact that we survived the Great Patriotic War and are still living by the legacy of the Stalin era is an indicator of the fact that in that era, these 4 interconnected tasks were being solved on the whole successfully. I have already mentioned that governance in society can be based on the spread of gossip and rumors. From the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, this is structureless governance. Structureless governance is possible in that class of objects which are called supersystem. A supersystem is a plurality of elements, every one of which has the following 3 qualities. It self-governs on the basis of the information and algorithmics which is in its memory. It can give out information from the memory into the environment, including other elements of the supersystem. It can receive information from other elements into its memory. But naturally, when an object receives information into its memory, then the information algorithmic content of this object changes, and accordingly the nature of self-governance can change. In supersystems, what can be called a structureless method of governance is possible. That is, if you pass an information algorithmic module of a certain content through the supersystem, then there exists a different from zero probability that a certain number of elements of the supersystem, in the process of their self-governance, form a certain structure. The structure will carry the algorithmics of governance, and the quality of governance will be acceptable. And there can be several such structures. Structural and structureless methods of governance in supersystems differ according to the following. With a structural method of governance, the architecture of a structure precedes the process of governance, its activation. But in structureless governance, structures form in the process of structureless governance. A natural question may arise: when is the quality of governance higher? And there is also the question, firstly, are evaluations of the quality of governance subjective? Secondly, are they conditioned by the task being solved? So, depending on the circumstances, either one or the other method may be more effective or be approximately the same. Here is another example of structureless governance in society. Look at the example with a bus and a ticket conductor. So you get on a bus, there is a conductor there to whom you give money. Then you get a ticket and you take a trip. If you don't know exactly where you need to get off, then in most cases the conductor is aware of what is on the route, and he or she will tell you. A bus without a conductor in Soviet times. You get on the bus, there is a ticket office box, you put money in there. If you need to split your money into smaller banknotes, one of the passengers may help you. If you need to ask where to get off, then one of the passengers will tell you. In both cases, the task of governance is the same: collecting money, handing out tickets, informing about stops along the route. In the first case, this task is solved by the structure called the conductor. In the second case, there is no structure, but all the passengers in the aggregate solve the same task. If we evaluate the effectiveness, the removal of the conductor causes the appearance of an additional number of stowaways, people who do not pay the fare. That is, Due to the increase in the number of stowaways, the transport company incurs some losses, and it also saves money at the expense of conductors' salaries. Therefore, the question is how many controllers are needed to make the system without a conductor more efficient? The next level of consideration. In order to produce a ticket, the following is required. Either to collect waste paper or to cut down trees, boil cellulose and make paper, then print this ticket, cut a ticket sheet into rolls, and so on and so forth. You have a ticket, then you get off the bus, and at best you drop it into the trash can. And the question arises that at a certain level of consideration, if we consider an encompassing system, then it is more purpose consonant to hang the costs of transport on the state budget, referring them to the infrastructure costs, and transport will be free. You save money on everything related to production of tickets and their distribution, and these resources can be utilized more effectively. A lot in the evaluations is conditioned by those conceptions of governance that act, and the subjectivism that generates these conceptions, or act within the boundaries of these conceptions. The tasks of governance, for the most part, are of this kind. The factor of subjectivism plays an important role. There is also governance on the basis of virtual structures. So, there is Supersystem 1, there is Supersystem 2. The correlation is such that every element of Supersystem 2 is an element of Supersystem 1. Suppose that the structure from Supersystem 1 penetrates into Supersystem 2. At the level of Supersystem 2, Supersystem 1 may not be seen, or may simply be beyond the perception for other reasons. By virtue of this circumstance, the elements included in the structure that penetrated into Supersystem number 1, they are perceived at the level of Supersystem 2 as mutually not connected. If the structure begins to work, then from the point of view of Supersystem 2, a certain number of its elements, by chance and causelessly, carried out certain actions, as a result of which something arose. In reality, there was governance, but it was not seen. In relation to real life, when is this relevant? There is a society that lives peacefully and well, and there is a resident spy network that is deployed in the society from another state or from a mafia. And then the moment comes, and this network begins to operate. From the point of view of others, this is all by chance, causeless and objectiveless, but this is governance. And we live in such a culture when what happens on the principles of structureless governance, or on the basis of governance on virtual structures, is not perceived as governance. This is governance on the basis of virtual structures. They seem to be present, but at the same time seem to be absent. And if this is not perceived as governance, then the reaction to it is the following. The question on how to block this governance, if it is hostile to someone personally or to society as a whole, does not arise. Again, if we move from all this to questions of social governance, then culture, from the point of view of the theory of governance, is an information algorithmic system. That is, it is aimed at certain objectives, carries in itself ways and methods of achieving them. Cultures differ from each other by a set of objectives and ways and methods of achieving them. Therefore, if something is absent in this culture, then certain tasks in it cannot be solved. Our neighbors in Ukraine are an example of this. There is no subculture of reproduction of statehood. And 23 years, counting before the Maidan, is enough time to build a quite functionally operable and stable self-reproducing statehood. There is no such thing in their culture. So, if in short, then I have told you everything about the sufficiently general theory of governance, and if in detail, then one lecture can be dedicated to the vector of objectives, another lecture to the vector of state, and so on and so forth. If one organizes the course correctly, then this will be enough for one semester for sure.
Как бы интересно, вы сказали, что два типа управленцев, да? Управленцы-психологи, но второй тип, так я так поняла, не назвали.
The second type is ordinary governors, who, in order to govern, must firstly be competent, governorially literate, must know the subject domain in which they are going to govern. These governors have no right to be incompetent. A governor psychologist may be incompetent. He will assemble a team that will be competent. This team will govern everything as needed. But a governor who is not a psychologist must be competent himself.
Такими управленцами рождаются или становятся?
Both. He can be both. I also want to say that in principle, this is poorly compatible with the atheistic worldview, because at a certain stage, when using this, one has to deal with phenomena that have no place in the atheistic worldview. Questions on religion and atheism are another theme. Here is an example of this. For us, the Battle of Stalingrad is a turning point in the Great Patriotic War. For the Americans, the Battle for Midway is a turning point in the war in the Pacific. To begin with, the Japanese suffered a defeat in Midway in the headquarters games on the maps. That is, this was already a prompt from above that the battle would be lost. It was necessary to go to shamans, negotiate something with them somehow. How was Midway lost in reality? The Japanese had a division of functions. Seaplanes, which were based on battleships, were intended for reconnaissance, and aircraft carriers inflicted strikes on enemy ships and coastal targets. The Japanese entered the Midway area and began to send reconnaissance seaplanes into the air. One of them broke down, a delay in departure of about 30 to 40 minutes. The rest of the planes went where necessary. No one spotted the American fleet, and the commander of the Japanese squadron decided to strike at Midway. On the aircraft carriers, the planes are on the deck, concrete-piercing and Fugas bombs are installed in them. Meanwhile, the broken-down seaplane has reached the place where it was supposed to and has found the American fleet. The Japanese make another mistake by acting according to a template. To strike at the ships, aircraft must be equipped with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. The Japanese are engaged in the transfer of weapons to aircraft. And at this time, American aviation strikes at the Japanese aircraft carriers. Imagine what can happen if, on an area of 150 meters by 15 meters, there are 36 aircraft, fully fueled, and right there on the decks, there is a double set of ammunitions, one that has just been removed, and the other that is being installed, and 1 or 2 bombs fall right there. Had the Japanese commander immediately given the order to strike at the American ships when they were found, albeit a less effective strike, Fugas, concrete-piercing bombs for the ships are not the type of ammunition that is needed, but still, this is ammunition, not empty barrels. The result of Midway could have been different. And if that seaplane, which was supposed to fly out for reconnaissance, had not broken down at all, then they could have struck at the Americans, having installed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in time. If you look at the course of military conflicts in history, accidents and coincidences of this type have played an important role in many conflicts. And these accidents and coincidences, for reasons unknown to atheists, struck those who were more wrong. Here is another example. Let's say you have a 380mm cannon on your ship, and the enemy ship is 20 kilometers away. What is the probability of hitting? The real number is from 2 to 3%. In the Battle of Jutland, the Germans achieved almost 3% and sank more ships than the British. The British crossed 2% and sank fewer ships. As the Germans sank more, they believed that they had won the Battle of Jutland. The British believed that they had won because they retained domination over the sea. 20 years later, it was a polar night. The German battleship Scharnhorst was trying to attack one of the convoys. The British covered the convoy, and with almost the first salvo, they destroyed the radar antenna on the Scharnhorst. It was a polar night. And what is the probability of hitting a radar antenna or a radar station from a distance of 20 kilometers? In the State Russian Museum there is a painting. The brig Mercury meets with the squadron after the battle. The Turks lag behind the brig Mercury after a cannonball of the Mercury had hit a waterstay on the Turkish battleship. To make it clear to those who are not familiar with nautical terminology, here is a ship. Here is a log called a bowsprit. And here is a rope that pulls the bowsprit. And then there are all sorts of rods and masts and all that, what is called standing rigging. And one of the cannonballs of Mercury hit a rope. You see, a smoothbore cannon, a projectile in which actually flails as it wants, because the caliber of the cannonball is less than the caliber of the cannon. To hit at a distance of hundreds of meters a circle with a diameter of 10 meters is a good result, especially when the sea is not calm. And the 84-gun battleship immediately decided that there was nothing for her to do there, and that she had to do other things. That is, if one looks at the entire apparatus of the theory of probability, again from the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, it turns out that the lower the probability of self-realization of an event, the higher the requirements for the qualification of the governor who takes up the endeavor. Because if the probability is 1, you can do nothing at all, just observe. And if the probability is vanishingly small, then you are required to have a very high professionalism of a governor, plus some support from above to this professionalism, so that episodes like the Japanese in Midway, the Turks with the Mercury, or like the Germans had, do not impact your activity.